Now we get to hear from some of the boys that Father played tennis with. I'm sure they've got some good stories to tell. First up, we'd like to hear from Bob Ruff.
I appreciate that comment about the boys. None of us that played with Stanley were boys. Stanley was never a boy. Stanley was old when I met him. I had a lot of things planned to speak to you about, but actually Bill covered most of them. He talked about the fire and the free lamps in Milwaukee. I had that as a big part of my speech. It's a long, long story. And I appreciate his saying that because I cut it out anyway, so I wouldn't bore you with it. He also talked about how, or and I was told that this morning by Mark Kaufman. Mark said, make sure you mention that. Well, obviously I don't have to mention that anymore because Bill already covered it.
Yes, yes, yes.
Stan was a very special person. He was a friend of mine for years and years. We were doubles partners in tennis. We played a lot of tennis together. I heard him make that call many, many times. And from my understanding, when he called it, it was the ball that he hit that was out, but he wanted them to call it in. Stan was one of the most intelligent, sharp, witty persons I've ever met. He was just fun to be with, and I enjoyed every minute that I was with him. Early in our relationship, I think back to a story he told me about when he went to a local doctor and the doctor treated him like a number. And Stan reacted to that. He was not a number, but he subjected himself to what the doctor said. He accepted the penicillin the doctor ordered for him, and he headed for Fort Worth. On the trip there, he broke out all over in hives. Obviously, he was allergic to penicillin, and his chart showed that. He went back to Sarasota. He called up the doctor, and he explained what had happened, and then a very meek, mild voice, as any number would say, and besides, I think that's worth about $350,000 from you. From that point on, the doctor said, what was your name? And he knew Stan's name from that point on, and he rolled out the red carpet, hoping that Stan would not press any action, and Stan never did. Now, as many of you know, Stan liked this kind of one-upmanship. He was ahead of you in his thinking. He would throw out thoughts, and if you were dumb enough to react to them, then he won. But on one occasion, after this penicillin bit, they found he needed a little more treatment, like a surgery. And as he was being rolled into the operating room, he thought he'd toss out a little gem for the nurse, and he said, will I be playing tennis in 30 days? And the nurse was much smarter than he was, and she said, yes, you will, Mr. Waldheim, but you won't be winning. I know this is a memorial for Stanley, and I really want to set the record straight. Some years ago, he and I played in a tennis tournament, the Herald Tribune, and he and I won that tournament. And unfortunately, I had to go out of town the next day. And that next day, the reporter showed up at the courts along with her photographer, and she wanted to interview the winners, and of course Stan was there. and asked Stan about what happened on the court, asked Stan about his life, and Stan volunteered everything he could about his family and his past history. And the photographer took pictures. And the next day in the Sarasota Herald Tribune, they had a picture of Stan, and he had a beautiful forehand, and there were 2 columns of Stan and his life and his family, and I don't know what else Stan volunteered. But in very small print, the last line it said, and Bob Ruff was his partner. Stanley, I want you to know at this point, I don't hold any hard feelings, at least not too many. Stanley was really an interesting person, one that we won't find many times in our lifetime. But Marianne and I had our 50th wedding anniversary, and we invited Stanley to say a few words, a lot fewer than I'm saying. Stan showed up, and not to say a few words, but when he was called on, he showed up with a hospital gown on, and if you can see my wife's hair over there, it's kind of dark. Stanley had on a wig, dark, and when called on to speak, he spoke in very high mimicry tones of Marianne. Marianne had just gotten out of the hospital. She had a near emergency, and Stan said, "Now, Marianne, I know you had to go to Tina's, your hairdresser, before you went to the hospital. And Marianne, I know when you're in the hospital, you love the hospital food. And Marianne, I know that when you left, you asked for a doggy bag so you could take some of this food home." I didn't really ask Stanley to do all that, but he did it anyway, and he did it very effectively. Another occasion that I remember when Stan was very effective, and I'm sure they didn't ask him to do that either, but he was at Harborside at the Longboat Key Club, and you see me standing here, and I stand here and I talk, and you probably remember 99% of nothing. Stan did something that I remember, and I'll always remember, because he told a story about when he went to tennis linesman school. I didn't know there was such a thing, but apparently Stan went to that. He went to a clown school too. I didn't know he did that. But he was having his final test, and he said the instructor was going to either approve what you did or disapprove. And he said you had to call the line, and I saw this person hit the ball, and I looked down there and I called it in. And the instructor came over and he looked at me and he went over to the line and he said, "It's out, and you're out, Stanley." And I remember that about Stanley because he was very demonstrative about what he did. I also remember the many times we had at the Longboat Key Club. Stanley was the second to run the tennis group that I'm involved in now. There are probably 120 men, and he was responsible for making sure that of the 30 or 40 that showed up, that they had the right partners and everybody was happy and content. He failed at that, and therefore he was fired. But actually he got a little ill, and I took over. But he was also a captain of many Longboat Key Club tennis members in the Sarasota Manatee Tennis League, and he was very successful at that. I remember Stanley was a very effective tennis player because he was my partner, and he was very effective, as everybody that played against him knows, at lobbing. and he loved people to death, and I loved it. And now is when I was going to say yes, 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 but that's been already covered. Stanley was fortunate to have just a wonderful family, and I think most of them are here today. We wish them the very, very best in the future, and I know all of us will think of Stanley and his family forever.
Very nice. Very good.